I wasn't angry when I saw the paper napkin. I was still, the kind of still you become when a truth finally lands. There it was, folded carelessly beside my plate, torn from a roll, thin and cheap, like something you'd use to wipe a coffee spill at a gas station. Everyone else at the table had linen napkins, triangle folded, embroidered with gold thread in their names. Varity, Gregory, even Nathan, but not me. It wasn't the napkin that hurt, it was the message, "You don't belong here." Hi, my name is Selene Marlo, and for most of my life, I believed that staying quiet made me strong, that if I kept working, kept building, kept my head down one day, they'd see, that they'd notice the hours, the ideas, the loyalty. But they never did. This is not a story about revenge. It's a story about clarity, about what happens when you stop waiting to be invited and build your own table instead. The steakhouse wasn't even fancy by Midtown standards. Not the kind of place you'd remember for the food, but the kind you went to for comfort and consistency, dim lighting, dark wood paneling, and an unspoken promise of formality. It was where my family gathered every other month to reconnect, though the conversations rarely ran deeper than surface updates and polite jabs dressed as jokes. That night, I arrived late. Not by choice, just another client call that ran over another day I poured more energy into work than anyone ever saw. When I walked in, the hostess greeted me with a smile just a bit too knowing. "They're already seated," she said, and led me through the restaurant past rows of families and candlelit tables. At ours, no one stood, no hugs, just a glance from my brother Nathan still scrolling his phone. My seat. It was tucked at the very end right beside the kitchen door that swung every 2 minutes with bursts of noise and heat. And then there was the napkin, or what pretended to be one. While everyone else had gold-trimmed linen, my place setting had a square of torn paper towel folded in half and dropped beside my plate like an afterthought. No embroidery, no name, not even a joke about it, just silence. The kind of silence that hums with meaning. I sat down anyway. It would have been easier if someone had said something cruel, something loud, because at least then I could have reacted. But silence. Silence strips you down gently, makes you question whether you're imagining it or whether this is just how people learn to remind you you're not one of them. Dinner unfolded as expected. Varity, my younger sister, announced her promotion VP of Client Strategy at our father's firm. The table clapped. My father beamed like she'd just solved climate change. When conversation drifted my way, he offered a chuckle and a dismissive Celine still figuring it out. The others laughed just enough to make it feel like a joke and not a knife. I didn't say much. I drank water with lemon. I folded the paper napkin once, then again. And in that quiet, something inside me shifted. Not anger, not yet, but a realization that no matter what I built outside those walls inside this room, I was still the afterthought. The one who was easier to leave out than to fully see. That dinner didn't break me, but it marked something. A point I can trace with a fingertip and say, there. That's when I stopped waiting for them to change. Because the truth is, sometimes the people who raised you can't recognize what you've become. Not because you're lost, but because you've grown too far beyond the version of you they needed to believe in. And so I left that napkin on the table untouched. The next day, I drove to a warehouse no one in my family even knew I leased. Because if I wasn't going to be given a seat, I would build the floor they didn't know they were standing on. There's something almost theatrical about family dinners, the way people play roles, take turns, offer praise, like applause lines in a sitcom. And that night, the performance was in full swing. Varity, in her blush pink blazer and carefully curled hair, lit up as she spoke about a client acquisition deal. 50 million across North America and Europe, she said, raising her glass like it was a trophy. The clapping came right on cue. Dad leaned in with his signature line, "Some of us build legacies." Then he looked at me and added, "And some of us, well, try." That pause between us and well cut deeper than any insult. Like he'd paused just long enough to consider something kinder and decided against it. But that's how it always was. The sharpest cuts never came from shouting. They came from pauses, from polite applause that somehow stopped before reaching your side of the table, from sentences you were never invited into. The truth is, people rarely exclude you with malice. They do it with familiarity, because they've grown so used to seeing you as less they don't realize they're shrinking you in real time. It doesn't feel like betrayal. It feels like routine. That night, I didn't defend myself. I didn't correct my father when he implied I was unemployed. I let my sister joke about my free time and watched as my mother redirected the conversation like it was a chess move. And maybe that's the part that hurt most, how natural it all felt to them. But here's the thing, they thought I was drifting. They thought I had given up. They didn't know I had walked away from a job I outgrew on my own terms. They didn't know I was already mid design on a platform that would reshape how small shipping businesses operate. They had no idea that every mockery, every overlooked moment, every folded paper towel was turning into fuel. There's a strange sort of peace that comes when you stop needing applause. When you realize that polite nods around dinner tables are cheap currency and real worth is built in quiet rooms far from the noise. So I smiled, folded that napkin one last time, and promised myself I would never ask for validation at a table where they kept forgetting to save me a seat. Instead, I would go back to where my real work lived, where the floors were dusty but the vision was clean. The warehouse didn't look like a beginning. It looked like a forgotten end, peeling paint, flickering floodlights, and a roof that groaned when it rained. There were bird nests in the rafters and a crack in the concrete floor that ran like a scar down the middle of the room. The lease terms were laughable. No one wanted it, which is exactly why I did. I remember walking in for the first time holding the keys with shaking hands. It smelled like rust and old plywood. But to me, it smelled like possible. I didn't need polished marble or ergonomic chairs. I needed a space to think, to build, to disappear and become something more. In that warehouse, I spread out old whiteboards from my tutoring days, rewired Ethernet cables I found on Craigslist, and coded at a secondhand desk with a drawer that stuck. I wasn't just building software, I was building the system I wish I'd had when I worked in logistics and watched small vendors struggle to keep up with big chains. My goal was simple: predict delays before they happened, help the overlooked operate like the elite. But I knew no one would take me seriously, not with my name, not as a soft-spoken woman with no Ivy League credentials. So I created a fake consultancy, gave it a sleek name, a virtual office, and pitched under that alias. It worked. They listened not because they knew who I was, but because the product delivered. Late at night, when the pipes rattled and the cold settled in, I used to sit cross-legged on the warehouse floor, laptop on my knees, and tell myself, one day, they'll sit in rooms I designed without ever realizing who laid the foundation. And that became enough. Not applause, not credit. Just knowing I could solve real problems without needing anyone's permission to begin. Still, there's a quiet kind of ache when the people closest to you can't or won't see what you're building. You start to wonder if they'll ever stop seeing you as the girl who needed help with math homework or always forgot to RSVP. The truth is, they weren't watching closely enough to realize I had already outgrown the story they kept writing me into. But someone else was watching, and not all eyes are kind. It happened quietly, as most real thefts do, not in broad daylight, but in the soft trust between sentences in the silence after I just wanted your opinion. I'd made the mistake of sharing a prototype dashboard with Varity over coffee. We weren't particularly close, but she'd asked in that sisterly way that made it feel like she finally saw me. Like maybe, this time, she wasn't just tolerating me, but actually curious about what I was building. She asked if she could see how it worked. I showed her. She asked if she could take a copy to study. I sent it. She said she wouldn't share it. I believed her. 3 months later, at Thanksgiving, I walked into my parents' house holding a homemade pie and watched my entire family toast her for saving a critical project with a visionary logistics model. I stood in the hallway still in my coat while my dad raised his wine glass and said to Verity, the strategic genius of the family, no footnote, no mention of me, just a room full of clinking glasses and a story that had been rewritten without the courtesy of asking permission. I didn't interrupt. I didn't say a word. I sat down in the corner of the room, let the laughter wash over me, and kept my hands in my lap. That night, I didn't cry in front of anyone. But when I got home, I opened my laptop, found the original source file with my name in the code, and quietly backed up every version, every email, every timestamp. It didn't make the news. There was no headline, no scandal. But it was a theft nonetheless, of labor, of legacy, of identity. People think stealing is about taking something physical, but often it's about erasing where it came from. And I learned something that day: when someone shows you they'll take credit, instead of offering credit, believe them. I didn't fight for recognition. Not then, not yet. But I promised myself one thing. The next time I told this story, I'd bring receipts. And I wouldn't whisper it in a hallway. Because quietly building something is noble, but quietly being erased, that ends now. I don't remember the exact day the switch flipped, but I do remember the feeling. I was sitting in the back of a conference room attending a vendor meeting under one of my own shell companies. The manager leading the presentation kept referring to the founder as if she were a myth, this elusive strategist who came up with the model everyone uses now. I watched as graphs lit up the screen, my graphs, my architecture, but no one said my name. And oddly enough, I didn't feel anger. I felt confirmation. That's when I realized I'd fed an entire system, employees, clients, subsidiaries, with my hands, my code, my weekends, and they'd grown so used to the nourishment they forgot to look up. That's what happens sometimes when you step back to make space. They start to believe the space was always empty. It wasn't just my family who'd rewritten the narrative, it was the industry. Slowly, subtly, my work became best practice while I remained a ghost, in the back end credited under a holding company no one cared to Google. I once overheard a junior associate refer to me as that quiet admin lady when I passed through a shared hallway. I smiled, not because it didn't sting, but because it reminded me how easy it is for people to overlook the very roots holding up the tree. But roots don't panic when the branches forget. They keep growing underneath without applause. So I leaned into that anonymity. I became strategic with it. I used it to buy into other companies to restructure systems silently. My name wasn't on plaques, but my signature was on paychecks. I was invisible by design, powerful by intention. Still, a question lingered. How long could you keep feeding a system that refused to recognize the hands that built it? And what happens when those same hands finally close the door? That answer was coming, and it would start with something as quiet as a login rejection. It started with one click, not a public statement, not a confrontation, just a silent keystroke on a quiet Monday morning. Begin phase one. I said into my Bluetooth headset as I stepped out of the elevator. My assistant Camilla responded calmly. Understood. That was it. No alarms, no meeting invites, just a series of quiet back-end changes that would ripple outward like a slow-moving current. Keycard access quietly rerouted, email permissions adjusted, server logs flagged. No one would notice at first. That was the point. Because true power, the kind that lasts, is never loud. It's procedural, strategic. It hides in the framework, not the fireworks. By mid-morning, Varity had already called IT. Her dashboard wouldn't load. Then her calendar disappeared. Then her access to executive folders returned a blinking red prompt, permission denied. Meanwhile, in HR, a private audit portal quietly opened, inviting employees to submit anonymous complaints about leadership culture. No memos were sent, no names were flagged. But within hours, the inbox began to fill. This place only promotes bloodlines. She calls me kiddo in front of clients. Leadership only cares about power, not people. They came like whispers, finally given room to speak. And I read every word. This wasn't revenge, this was architecture. Because when people build little kingdoms within the house you designed, it's only a matter of time before they forget whose name is on the deed. And when they forget, that's when you remind them. Not with noise, but with receipts. Not with rage, but with readiness. I didn't need to barge into a room. I was the room. And the next one they entered would lock behind them. The room was quiet when they entered, too quiet. Conference room 9B had never felt particularly large before, but that morning, it swallowed every sound like a cathedral. Verity's heels clicked first, sharp and quick. My father's shoes followed heavier, slower, as if he was already suspicious of the air. The moment the door closed behind them, a clean mechanical click echoed through the space. Not loud, just final. They paused. "What is this?" my father asked, already frowning. Another compliance check. Verity tried to joke, her voice too tight to land. I didn't answer. I simply gestured to the table where 10 folders sat waiting. Inside, company registrations, stock transfer memos, shell company maps, and the signature page from a forgotten merger agreement. The one that quietly transferred Class B shares to a firm I'd long controlled. My name, Selene Marlo, was there in ink, majority shareholder, undisputed. My father flipped pages faster, now hands stiff. Verity didn't open hers. She stared like the folder might catch fire. "This is a trick," he said finally. "No," I replied softly. "This is paper and history. Yours just didn't include me." Then I pressed a small remote. A speaker crackled overhead. Their own voices played back laughter comments from an off-site retreat. If you cut the women out of the room, decisions move faster. If they're not family, they're disposable. Each word landed heavier than the last. The board listened in stunned silence. No one looked up. Then the legal counsel stood and cleared his throat. These remarks, coupled with ethical complaints and shareholder manipulation, trigger immediate review. Resignations will be expected by end of day. Verity whispered, "You can't do this." I straightened my blazer. "You did this." I'm just reading it out loud. It wasn't anger that filled the room. It was recognition. For once, they understood they couldn't rewrite the story anymore, not when the author was still in the room. And as I walked out, the lock behind me clicked again. But this time, I was on the outside with the keys. I never planned to go viral. I never needed it. For most of my life, I found safety in the background, letting others speak louder, take credit, take space. But that changed the day. Someone posted two photos on LinkedIn, one from the early days, a dusty group shot inside the warehouse, where I was half hidden behind a folding table. The other, an unedited version of the same moment this time, with me front and center, laughing mid-sentence, fully seen. The caption was simple. She built it. They just stood in front of it. The post spread faster than I expected. Comments poured in from former interns, past colleagues, even competitors. Thank you for proving we don't have to shout to be powerful. I remember when they called you the quiet one. Turns out you were just focused. My old manager told me not to dress too ambitious. Now I send your quote to my new team. And just like that, the narrative changed because someone dared to retell it without cutting me out. Varity and my father tried to respond. A video, dim lighting, concerned voices, words like family and misunderstanding tossed around like safety nets. But truth has its own momentum. Internal emails leaked, whistleblowers surfaced. One woman posted, "I was told I didn't fit the culture." Now I realize that meant I wasn't related. And all I did was record a quiet message. No lights, no filter, just me sitting at my desk. I don't believe in takedowns, I said, but I do believe in truth. And success built on silence is fragile. It wasn't just a clip. It was a mirror reflecting what so many women, so many overlooked builders had carried for years. And maybe that was the lesson. Sometimes when silence breaks, it doesn't shatter, it sings. But vindication, as powerful as it felt, wasn't the end. The next step, the one that mattered most, wasn't proving who I was. It was deciding what kind of space I'd build next for the ones coming after me. It wasn't enough to remove the rot, you had to rebuild the soil too. After the resignations and the fallout, the company was left standing but shaken. People walked quieter in the hallways, unsure of what would come next. You could feel it in the break room, pauses in the glances exchanged during meetings. They were waiting for another hierarchy, another name to fill the silence. But I didn't want to fill it. I wanted to reshape it. So we began not with slogans or rebrands, but with small things. We opened up the mentorship program this time to every employee, not just rising stars, handpicked by someone's cousin. We restructured promotions to be committee reviewed and anonymized. Feedback loops were rebuilt from scratch. And for the first time in the company's history, janitorial staff were invited to monthly strategy sessions. Not because it was a PR move, but because they saw things the rest of us didn't. I still remember Kayla, the intern, who once left a meeting in tears, raising her hand in a cross-functional review and challenging a product flow. Her logic was airtight. No one interrupted her. Afterward, she pulled me aside and whispered, "I didn't think I was allowed to speak like that here." I looked at her not as a CEO, not as a mentor, but as someone who'd been that girl once. "You are now," I said, "and the next one will be because of you. Culture isn't a memo. It's a mirror, and you can't rebuild one without breaking the old frame first." But even as the walls softened and the air changed, I knew something still lingered, an ache not from what had happened, but from what had been missing all along. And it would arrive quietly in a box I hadn't expected from someone I hadn't heard from in years. The package arrived on a Thursday afternoon. Brown cardboard edges worn my name scribbled across the top in handwriting I hadn't seen in over a decade. My mother's. Inside were a few old photographs, a faded charm bracelet, and a sealed envelope. I sat in the quiet of my office sunlight stretching across the hardwood floor and unfolded the letter. It was short, just a few lines. The ink had smudged in places, but I could still read it. "Don't let them shrink you to fit their world. You were born to build your own." My throat tightened, not from sadness, but from recognition. That someone once had seen this path before I even stepped on it. She'd watched me disappear in the corners of rooms, watched me fold myself to make others comfortable. And yet she'd known I wouldn't stay small forever. That night, I framed the note and hung it above my monitor, next to a newly printed plaque: CEO, Selene Marlo, no initials. No hiding, just the name I was born with finally placed where it always belonged. Across the office, another frame sat on a bookshelf, the unedited photo from the warehouse, the one where I stood in the middle, not behind. I didn't need applause anymore, just space. And now, when I walk through the lobby past the glass reception wall etched with our new values, I see people pause to read the inscription beneath. Some of us don't raise our voices. We build rooms where everyone else finally can. That's the frame I built. Not for recognition, but so no one else would have to make themselves smaller to belong. And if I've learned anything through all of this, it's this: your voice doesn't have to be loud to matter, but it does have to be yours. And once you find it, don't ever let them take it again.